What's going on, everyone? In this video, I'm going over my Haddonfield Survivor winner rankings. Now, this is something I've been wanting to do for a while. Now that Legends is over, it's kind of the perfect time to do it. Who knows if there'll be more Haddonfield Survivor after this. As all of you know, I'm kind of flip-floppy on that topic, so we're just going to assume there's not going to be more Haddonfield Survivor for this video and rank the 9 winners that we do have. So before I start this video, I gotta go over a couple caveats because, as we all know, Haddonfield Survivor, sort of a mess. Each season going into it, there's a lot of outside of the game relationships that come into play. Some people have it really easy going into certain seasons. No one's ever guaranteed to win, but there are definitely instances where the winner had a much more favorable cast than in other instances. However, for the sake of this video, I'm just going to mostly ignore that. Not completely, but, you can't really evaluate people's games based on that. Yes, someone might have had their friends there on one season, but if they played a really good game regardless, I'm not going to discredit them just because the cast was, better for them than it could have been. Also, I should probably talk about my philosophy on the game of Survivor, which I'm sure all of you care a lot about, all 5 of you that are watching this video. I care about dominance, control in the game, idols and advantages, and winning immunity. Not really a big fan of that. It's fine, but for the sake of me ranking the winners, what I'm going to be ranking mostly is social strategic gameplay, whether or not they were in on votes, whether they were making the right decisions, controlling the game, had good relationships, had good jury prospects, whether they were just in a good spot in the game, controlling things, making good decisions, stuff like that. That's what I care about. Now, this ranking is not a ranking of these 9 people as players. If we were ranking them just as players, in the grand scheme of things, it would be a different list. And you can check out the tier list, because that basically has them in order of what I think of them as players. This is a ranking of the games they played to win the game on the season that they won. Now, that might be slightly confusing to some of you, but I'm just looking at the one season they won and looking at their path to the win and comparing that against all the other winners. I hope to a certain extent that makes sense to all of you. Last thing I want to clarify is who's actually being ranked right here. So, as I said before, I'm ranking 9 people, the winners of season 1 through 9 of Haddonfield Survivor. Now, within that, there's obviously some variance because, seasons 1 and 2, long time ago, very small casts. But I'm including them regardless. I'm effectively treating all 9 seasons equally. I will not be including virtual Haddonfield Survivor, which took place in April of 2020. But if I was including Jake, the winner of Virtual Survivor, he'd be extremely high on the list, if not number 1. But I can't really consider a virtual game on Instagram the same thing as an actual Survivor game. Sorry, Jake. I'm also very obviously not including Big Brother because Haddonfield Big Brother, while kind of similar, it's just straight up not the same game at all. And for the 4 of you that are watching that care about this, I'm also not including Williamstown Survivor, even though I was there. So I'll say right now that if Noah was on the list, he'd be exactly in the same spot as Parker. And if Chris, winner of season 2, was on the list, he'd be pretty high, number 2 or 3, probably. But I'm not actually going to talk about those in detail, and they're technically not being included on the list. Alright, so 4 minutes into the video, let's actually get started on the list. Like I said, 9 winners to talk about. Coming in at the very bottom, 9th place, we have the winner of Haddonfield Survivor Season 2, and that's Evan. And I actually want to say that I don't really think that many of the Haddonfield Survivor winners are actually bad. When you look at actual Survivor, some of the winners are just straight up terrible players, or they played awful games. I don't really think that's the case with Haddonfield Survivor. You tend to have a lot of players that are pretty mid, but a lot of the winners are actually not examples of that. A lot of them played pretty good games. So Evan's here at the bottom, and his game's not that good, but it's really not the worst thing in the world. If this was an actual Survivor winner ranking, this would kind of be the top of the bottom tier, but still kind of a bottom tier win. So going actually into his game, Evan was only 12 when this season happened, easily the youngest winner, so kind of weird to rank it. And there were only 8 people in this season, But if we're actually looking at the game, he was basically the second in command person to Philip the entire game, and they kind of made some questionable decisions. Yes, they controlled the first 2 votes on their tribe. However, they do go to rocks in round 1, which is ridiculous, and he almost went home. I'm not seriously going to fault him for that, because if he did flip on Philip, he just goes home second. So I do kind of get it. Round 2, Philip thinks he's flipping on him. So Philip wastes the idol, which they totally could have used together. So that's kind of a knock, I guess. But more a knock on Philip, so whatever. He's pretty safe at the swap, doesn't go to tribal. At the merge, him and Philip get flipped on, and Philip gets blindsided. So gotta knock him there. He then gets picked up by Mackay to vote out Declan. Sure, that's fine. And then at final 3, he's going to the end regardless. Both Louis and Mackay are going to take him, and he wins in every scenario. The problem is, I don't think he actively did anything to actually get to that situation, and people just didn't like the other options. So, overall, incredibly passive game. A couple big hiccup spots on the game, but overall just, kind of mid. It's not really that bad. He was in the majority for a lot of the game, and he had a lot of win equity going towards the end of the game. So it's fine. It's just still the worst Haddonfield Survivor game. All right, so moving on to number 8. We have the winner of Haddonfield Survivor Season 7, and that's Parker. Now, I know what you're thinking, Parker. This is way too low, but I do want to say that I actually don't think Parker's game is that bad either. I'm still having it as a bottom tier win, but it's the tippy top of bottom tier, because truly, Parker doesn't actually do that much wrong on this season. He's just incredibly passive. In the pre-merge, him and Camden are kind of a mess. They vote out Dan, which is fine, I guess, but he makes a good relationship with Bucci, so that's good. He doesn't go to any tribal councils till the merge after that, so that's fine, I guess. In the early merge section of the game, he's in the majority, I guess, but he's voting for Tovi every round, which he likes to say is because he didn't know what was going on, but I think that's probably revisionist history, and he just was doing that because Bucci told him to. But that's neither here nor there. Regardless, he was pretty safe in this section of the game. He won a couple immunity challenges. Towards the middle of the merge, there were a lot of flips that were happening, and he was on the right side of most of them, except for when Bucci got flipped on, which I will knock his game for. He gets into the end game, and he's kind of the middle player in the final 5, where Will and Jane are on one side, Dom and Tovi are on the other. He chooses the Dom and Tovi side, which is probably a good decision, but he has to go to fire anyway, and he probably would have anyway, regardless, but he does win fire against Jane, and he gets really lucky that Dom bombs his final tribal, because Dom came into final tribal winning the game. Jane and Will were going to vote for him, probably, and he just gives a terrible speech and doesn't answer any of the questions very well. Now, I'm not saying Parker answered them very well, but at least they found him amusing, and that's why Will and Jane end up voting for him. But he does barely win the game. It's a 3-2-2 vote, which is still crazy, and I gotta fault him a little bit for that, because his win was so finicky. One thing goes differently, he doesn't win the game. And I do think he loses to most other people who were in the end game. If Bucci got there, if Will or Jane got there, he probably loses. But overall, there's not too much to say about Parker, because he was in the majority for most of the game, had a couple good relationships, and didn't do a whole lot. He won a lot of challenges, so that's a minor boost that I'll give him, but I don't really care about that much. Overall, incredibly passive game, still bottom tier, but it's not that bad. He did some things, and he was safe, so not much else to say. Quick side note here, I want to talk about something that's kind of pertinent to Parker specifically. I want to talk about the difference between managing your threat level and actually not being a threat. So when you're talking about Parker, he legitimately wasn't a threat. He doesn't win in most scenarios. He's not doing much, so he's not coming across as threatening to people. He's actually not a threat, which is a valid strategy, I will say, and he actually plays it well. But it's not as impressive as the other strategy, managing your threat level, which is when you actually are a massive threat. You're doing a lot in the game, but you're making it seem like you're not that so that people won't try to get rid of you. And that's a strategy that I really respect, and that some players way later that we'll be talking about on the list actually do really well. But the two things are completely different and should not be talked about as the same thing. Both are valid strategies, but the one that describes Parker is much more passive and definitely lands him more towards the bottom of the list. Anyway, just a side note. So let's move on. So we're actually now moving into the middle tier of the list. These are winners who I would consider mixed. Like, they have some really good aspects of their game, some really bad aspects, some passive. It's really a mixed bag in this tier. Starting that tier off, we have the original winner of Haddonfield Survivor, Declan. And Declan's game is definitely better than the last two. I think the first half of his game is actually pretty good. Now, was this the case just because his tribe was filled with people he was friends with? Yes, but I'm not actually going to discredit him for that. He is the center of the tribe during the first half. Him and Philip are the core of the alliance. They blindside Quinn at the first vote, which I'll give him a lot of credit for because he kept Sam in as a shield and a buffer and someone who was loyal to him. And it really gave Oshin no other path in the game, forced him to work with Declan, so I'll give him a lot of credit. It's definitely the best move made by anyone I've talked about so far. He loses Philip at the second vote, but that's just because of an idol, and you gotta credit him for having a better relationship with Sam, and Sam doesn't idol him out. He's then the core of the tribe, with Sam on one side, Oshin on the other. He does vote Sam out next, which I would say is probably a bad decision. I understand why he did it, but he probably should have kept Sam because, like, no one's going to work with Sam except for him, and they'll vote Sam out before him, so Oshin was definitely a bigger threat. At the merge, you gotta massively discredit him because he's just completely on the bottom. Oshin has completely outplayed him and is in an alliance with everyone else, and he's all alone. He's only spared at the final 5 because Samuel makes a mistake and they want to flip on him, and then at final 4, he's only spared because he finds an idol. And that wouldn't have even been allowed in modern Haddonfield Survivor, where idols aren't even allowed to be used at Final 4. But yeah, he gets to the Final 3, and he wins. Only in a 4-3 vote, though, so gotta knock him a little bit for that. But he does beat anyone if he gets to the end with them. I mean, there's no combination where he loses. As long as he's sitting at the end, he wins this season. So, I mean, there's highs and lows. Like, the beginning of the game, really good. His win equity at the end, really good. But those, like, middle 3 rounds are kind of shaky, especially the final 4. If he had no idol, he just goes home. So I definitely have to take points away from him for that. And he also, like, wasn't super active in the game. A lot of this was just preseason. And I know I said I wouldn't care about that, but, like, this was kind of just the position he landed in. So he's not, like, an active strategic player to a massive degree, even though I will give him some credit for, like, the Quinn move. It's a semi-dominant game. That's why he ends up here in the middle tier. But because of how inactive he was and that massive flawed Final 4, he's at the bottom of the middle tier. All right, still in the middle tier, but moving on. At number 6, we have the winner of Season 6, and that's Harry. And Harry's game is the definition of, like, a middle tier Survivor game. Well, not Survivor game, actually. Most Haddonfield Survivor players are bad. So, definition of a middle tier winning game on Survivor. He has some really high highs. He has a lot of control throughout the game, but he has a couple points where it's just he's not playing well at all, and it's really bad. But collectively, you can't really knock him too much because it's only a couple points in the game. So at the beginning of the game, he starts off, and he does pretty poorly in that first round. So he actually doesn't go to Tribal for like 4 rounds because the other tribe sucks, but when he does go to Tribal, him and Ted immediately isolate themselves and make themselves social pariahs, despite the fact that most of this tribe was band kids that totally should have been working with him from the beginning. They do have an idol, and even though Ted plays the idol on Harry, Harry goes home without that idol. Like, he got the majority of the votes from this tribe of people who totally should be working with him, so I'm going to massively fault him for that. Now, after that, there's the swab, and he actually recovers pretty well. He gets back with the band kids now that Ted's gone and not sinking his game. On his swab tribe, it's 4 band kids against Elliot and Lucy, and Harry actually commands a split vote in this round, which, like, a split vote isn't actually that much of a complicated Survivor strategy, but on Haddonfield Survivor, where a lot of the players suck, something like that is actually kind of impressive and doesn't happen all that often, so you gotta give him credit for successfully splitting the votes, and he gets Lucy out. Sure, that's fine. She was against him. He then wins the next 2 challenges, gets to the merge. At that point, it becomes the Mackay and Harry war for all the band kids' numbers, and he actually wins. He gets Elliot and Steven to join him and his group of band kids, which you gotta give him a lot of credit for, because I get why they did it, but it was kind of up in the air. Like, you could make an argument on both sides, so the fact that Harry pulled them in, like, pretty impressive, honestly. He gets Ari out of the next round, further weakening the remainder of the Mackay side, and Elliot and Evan are being idiots this round and wasting their idols and advantages, so, I mean, that's not really Harry's doing, but it definitely helps him. He then proceeds to get Elliot out. Pretty good move, because Elliot has started to turn on him. Then at the final 7, he's got his group of band kids. He picks up the remainder of the Mackay band kids, and then it's them versus Steven and Evan, and he actually joins Evan and Steven to vote Scott out, which I used to be super high on, and I still think it's probably the right move because Scott was a big immunity threat, big jury threat. So I'm definitely going to give him credit for this, but like, it's kind of an unnecessary move, but whatever. Final 6, he gets rid of Evan, who was targeting him, so that's fine. Then at Final 5, he gets rid of Steven, also fine. He was probably going to get targeted by him too. And he does vote with both Evan and Steven when they go home, and that definitely helps with the jury prospects for him. But I will say during this part of the game, like after Scott goes home, Ryan goes on an immunity tear, and because this is blood versus water, that means Harry's immune also. So that really didn't give the rest of the tribe an opportunity to flip on him. And I do think they probably would have at some of these rounds without that. So in some ways you could say he won out, but it's kind of unclear. And then Ryan quits at the Final 4, which is also an unclear situation. Like, would Harry have gone home at Final 4? I'm not really sure, because Brian totally could have gone home also. So it's a little unclear. And he wins at the end 5-3-1. Pretty good showing, and most of the jury was on his side, even like Arabella's closest friends, so gotta give him a lot of credit for being respected at the end. Even though a lot of the jury didn't really like him, they just acknowledged that he played a better game. So yeah, Harry's game starts off terrible, then it gets pretty good. The middle game, the swap, and the early merge, really good. The end game, I have no idea what to think about because I don't know if he gets voted out without those immunities. And his jury prospects are fine because people thought he controlled the game, but people also didn't really love him, so it's kind of mixed on that end also. So yeah, he just ends up as a middle tier winner. Semi in control of the game, in control at some parts, not in control at others. He's got a couple flaws here and there, but overall, some impressive maneuvers. He lands here at number 6. All right, we're already at the top 5. Kind of crazy. So at number 5, I have the winner of season 5, and that's Chris. Chris Weaver, not the other Chris. We'll talk about him in a little bit. So Chris from season 5, easily the most underrated Haddonfield Survivor winner. When he won this game, everyone was so angry. They were shitting on his game a lot. I personally think those people were both sulking because they lost and also just straight up didn't understand the game that Chris played and didn't understand that it was actually pretty good. Definitely not perfect. It's still a middle tier game because there's some points where he didn't have control. And yes, he does win out, so that's a big knock. But I actually think compared to most of the winners we've talked about so far, he did the most to control his own fate in the game. And he also probably had some of the most impressive strategic moves and social maneuvers on this season, especially compared to everyone we've talked about so far. Like, Chris might actually be like top 2 or 3 if we're talking about straight up impressiveness and skill required to play the game. But this game isn't without its holes, so it's definitely still got to be here at number 5, towards the top of the middle tier. So Chris starts off the game on the Hero Tribe, which is a tribe full of people he doesn't really know. However, because of the nature of this tribe, there's one group led by Elliot, one group of like, you know, the Evan, Lapid, Samir, Jason group. So he kind of just ends up in the middle because there's these two groups. But I will give him so much credit because he makes a good relationship with Elliot, a good one with Ian, a good one with Caleb. I guess a good one with Jane. I'm not really sure about that. And then the Class of 22 group also doesn't really dislike him either. So he's in a perfect middle spot on this tribe. And a lot of that is happenstance, but it's also pretty good social work from him. He goes with the Elliot group to vote out Evan and Jason. Pretty good. I'll give him credit there. At the third vote, Isaac goes home, which I will fault him for because that's kind of a move being made by the Elliott group to weaken him. So you got to discredit him a little bit for that. But they're still keeping him in. Like, he's still safe during that round. You also got to give him credit because Elliott finds the hero idol, like the regular idol, not the special one. And he also finds the super idol, and he tells Chris about this. Chris is literally the only person in the game, as far as I'm aware. I don't know if Ian knew, but as far as I'm aware, he's the only person who knew about Elliott's idols, which shows how strong of a relationship he had with him, which is doubly impressive because Chris doesn't actually know any of these people. Like, he had barely spoken to Elliott before this game, and he already had a pretty good relationship with him. So I'm not taking previous relationships into account on this list, but I'm giving Chris a lot of credit because he didn't know like anyone, and he was making all these good social relationships. So definitely a top-tier social player. At the swap tribe, he's kind of given a shitty swap, but he doesn't have to go to tribal, so, that's whatever. I don't know if he would have gotten voted out, but it would have been being swap screwed if he did, so not going to discredit him for that. Then we get to the merge, and I do think the merge round is a little bit hazy. Now, at this round, the villains had like a super majority on the tribe, so they wanted to vote out some of the heroes. They weren't ready to flip on each other yet. And Chris probably was going to be one of the people they voted for, but he does win immunity. Like, it probably would have been split between him and Elliott if he didn't have immunity, so that's kind of a knock. But it is in this round that he ends up not telling Elliott to play his idols and just letting him go home with the idols in his pocket, which you could say is a questionable move. Like, why would you let your ally go home, and why would you let two idols that you both could have used get out of the game? But he likes to rationalize this by saying, like, he wanted Elliott and the idols to go so that he would be, like, not a threat anymore, and he would be overlooked so that the villains could just start going for each other now, which is what happens. I do think it's what would have happened anyway the next round. So, I don't know. I could take this move or leave it. I don't think it's, like, the most impressive move ever, but it's fine. At the next round, the villains start cannibalizing each other, and you gotta give Chris a lot of credit because he forms a pretty good relationship with Cyrus, which is good, especially because the Will side is definitely stronger, so it's good to join the Cyrus side. Ben goes home that round, fine. Will wastes his idol, which is good. Next round, they get rid of Will, also pretty good. That vote's a little bit weird because Chris is getting some random stray votes during like a split vote plan, but I do think him and Caleb and Cyrus play it pretty well. Chris successfully gets Cyrus to waste his idol while also voting with him to get rid of Will, so it's a pretty good move. Honestly, this middle part of the merge, pretty good from Chris, especially socially, because he's got this alliance with him, Cyrus, Caleb, and Harry. It's an alliance of 4 people that totally shouldn't be an alliance. All 4 of them have no pre-established relationship. There's no connection between any of them, and they're in a solid alliance. So Chris definitely gets a lot of credit for that, in my opinion. Final 7, Oshin goes home, and that's just because he quits. So, like, it's kind of a cop-out, but I do think him, Caleb, Harry, and Cyrus would have actually been fine that round. But it's a little bit debatable because Caleb, like, he could have gone with the other group, but whatever. Final 6, it's 3-3 because Caleb's not willing to vote out any of his remaining alliance members on the other side. And they do lose out on this vote because of an extra vote, but, like, I'm not going to discredit him for not knowing about an advantage. At Final 5, it's just him and Harry against the other 3, so he's down in numbers, but a lot of that is not really his fault. He did plan on keeping Cyrus in another round more, which would have only meant that he would have had to win the final immunity challenge, but in the situation we did get to, he had to win 2 immunity challenges at the end. And he does win both of them, but it's kind of a win-out, which is something I don't really credit people that much with because it's not really social strategic gameplay. It's just winning challenges. And he does get to his ideal final 3. He gets there with Harry and Caleb, who both suck, so he easily wins. Now, the jury didn't want to vote for him. They were kind of unhappy that he got there, but they obviously weren't going to vote for Caleb or Harry. So I don't know. Overall, I think the game's really impressive. Socially, on the Heroes tribe and in that mid-merge section, really good. His positioning's really good. The Elliott move's a little bit questionable, and him winning out at the end is a little bit questionable. But those are kind of more minor knocks, honestly, than what I'm knocking against Harry and Declan's game. So that's why Chris is kind of towards the top of the middle tier. That, along with the fact that his game is probably more impressive because of the level of difficulty that came into it. Like, Declan and Harry had a lot more people that they knew on their season. Chris really didn't, so I'm more impressed by Chris's game. He had some better strategic moves. Only a couple holes in his game, so that's why he's up here at number 5. All right, moving on to number 4. We're still in the middle tier, but we're now at the top of the middle tier. And we have the most recent winner, the winner of Haddonfield Survivor Legends, the other Chris D. And I thought about Chris D's game a lot. I was really unsure about where to put it. I do think there are enough holes in it to leave it out of the top tier, but it's still pretty good. So Chris starts off the game on the yellow tribe, and I think he's in a pretty good spot. I mean, Max and the other Chris are massive threats, so he's able to be like a secondary threat and pull in a lot of the other numbers, like Brian. He's obviously with Dom, and he has a pretty good relationship with Max also, which is good. So the fact that they send other Chris home is pretty good. He finds the idol, which he obviously is really good at, and that's obviously a positive too. The Yellow Tribe only loses one challenge, which is like kind of lucky, because had the Yellow Tribe lost like 2 or 3 of the 4 challenges, then Max would have gone home, which would have been a little bit bad for his game. Maybe even Dom would have gone home, I don't know. But yeah, we go into the merge, and a lot of the people that he wanted at the merge were still in. Like, he's got his people from the Yellow Tribe. He's got Brian and Dom. On the Purple Tribe, I mean, he's joined by Jane, who he's been wanting to work with, and Aiden, who he obviously is going to work with. So it's a pretty favorable shakeup at this point in the game. Like, he's pretty much got all the people he wants to have in the game still in. In the merge round, they get Carson out, which, like, isn't really what he wanted to have happen. So I'm going to knock him a little bit for this, because while it's not really bad that Carson goes home here, he didn't want it to happen. He wanted to send Max home, and they kind of just messed up the votes and miscommunicated. So I'm going to fault him for that, because that's kind of stupid. And also, sending Max home here probably would have been a little too early, because, like, who's the next biggest threat after that? Definitely either Dom, him, or Aiden. So they probably should not have voted Max out that early, even though they wanted to. Now, obviously, it works out for them, but kind of short-sighted thinking. At the final 7, they do vote up Max, and I'll give him a lot of credit because he leads the charge on this vote. He has Jane on his side. He tells Dom and Aiden to split the vote, which actually makes Michael kind of distrustworthy of Aiden and Dom, which is good. I don't know if he intentionally did that, but it was actually a good side effect of this vote. And I do think at this point it was probably a good move to get rid of Max, because Dom was kind of a bigger threat than him at this point in the game, so he still had a threat ahead of him. He had a good relationship with basically everyone still in the game. Brian, Jane, Aiden, so it was probably a good move. And he leads the charge here, so gotta give him credit for that. Final 6 is interesting because him, Aiden, and Dom, basically at this point in the game, they lock in together because they realize that everyone doesn't like them, which is true. The jury really didn't like Dom and Aiden, but I actually don't think they really disliked Chris at all. I do think he probably still would have beaten most of the people who got to the end. Jane's a little bit questionable, but I think Chris basically wins by the time of the final 5, probably. He probably beats Brian and Michael, in my opinion. I mean, you look at the jury members, and, like, Max and Chris W. really respected Chris. Same with Carson. So, like, he was probably going to win by that point in the game. So it didn't really matter what he did, and he does end up going with Dom and Aiden. He goes against Jane and against Brian, which is fine. Like, he's friends with Dom and Aiden. They're not big jury threats at this point, so I don't know if he really knew that, but, like, I actually think it's fine. Like, yes, he could have just voted out Dom here, but then they might have tried to flip on him, so I actually think it's fine. Like, voting out Jane here actually kind of makes sense, because she is probably the biggest jury threat left in the game. Final 5, they get rid of Michael. Sure, he won some challenges and is, like, kind of an underdog. I mean, Chris still beats Michael, but it's a good move, whatever. Final 4, Aiden wins immunity, refuses to put Dom and Chris in the fire-making challenge, goes in himself, which eliminates Brian and kind of sinks Aiden's winning chances even further. But, I mean, Chris was going to win by this point anyway, as long as he didn't get eliminated in fire. So really thinking through his game, I mean, there's not all that many holes in it. I do think he probably loses to, like, Max and Jane, but that was kind of far back, so you can't really fault him too much for that. And he does get rid of those players. I'll fault him a little bit for the Carson vote because that was kind of a mess. And also, I think he got a little bit lucky that his tribe won so many challenges at the beginning. I also think him going to the end with Dom and Aiden was like, it's fine. That's the thing I'm not really sure about. Like, was it a good move to go with Dom and Aiden and to not flip on them and to just get rid of all the Haddonfield people? That's what I'm not sure about. I don't actually think he made that many bad decisions in this game. I think he actually made a lot of good decisions, and I debated actually putting him one spot higher on this list, but I just couldn't because the number 3 player on this list just played such a good game. Like, there are probably slightly more holes in their game, but it's just so impressive that I couldn't put it below Chris's. Not to say that Chris's game isn't good. I mean, Chris controlled a lot of the game. He had good relationships, pretty high win equity, and only made a couple mistakes in the game. But his line of thinking is slightly flawed in some spots, and I'm not so sure about some of his decisions, but I don't know. It could be recency bias, like, against Chris, honestly. I think there's a serious argument that he should be probably number 3 on this list. Definitely not 2 or 1, but I really debated between him and number 3. But yeah, I ended up going with Chris at number 4. He's effectively on the line between middle tier and top tier. So yeah, he's here at number 4. Moving on. All right, top 3 winners. All of these winners are top tier winners. Really good players. Their games have very few holes in them. But at the bottom here at number 3, the bottom of my top tier, I have the winner of Season 3, and that's Max Cass. And for a while, if you would have asked me who played the best winning game, I would have said Max. I think Max's game is incredibly impressive. Probably the most impressive winning game. However, I can't deny the fact there's a couple massive glaring flaws in his game, and I just can't overlook them. Like, despite the fact that the rest of his game is probably above the next 2 people. Like, it's crazy good. I just can't put someone with 1 or 2 rounds of flaws above the next 2 players when they have, like, literally no flaws, even if it's slightly less impressive. But yeah, let's go through Max's game, because he also, like the first Chris W., he didn't really have that many relationships going into Season 3. I mean, yeah, he had his brother and a couple of the people, like, in the class of 2020, he knew, whatever, like Ian and Ted, whatever. But he's put on a tribe, the Blue Tribe, full of people who are friends with each other, and he's able to get them to turn on each other and vote each other out. Super impressive. He makes a good relationship with Ian, with Ted, with Declan, with Sam T. He's got a lot of good relationships on this tribe, and is basically directing the votes against, like, Vinny and Dan and O'Sheen, so pretty impressive. At the swap, he swapped to a pretty favorable position. He's put with mostly his alliance members on his tribe. They have a pretty easy target in Mackay to get out, so they only lose that one challenge and get rid of him. At the merge, Max sets up this amazing power structure, and I think I've talked about it before, but, like, the way Max is able to set up the game at this point in the game is uncomparable to anyone else. Like, it's leagues above anyone else's positioning in any season. Basically what happens here is Max's original alliance members from the Blue Tribe, Ian and Ted, they both have an add-on because Ian's friends with Caleb, Ted has his brother Harry. So Max basically makes it so that those alliances are 3-person alliances that he's, like, the third number in. And they don't know that he's in all the other alliances, basically. Then there's this alliance with Jane and Evan, which also kind of includes Ben. So he has all of these alliances, but they're all centralized with him. Him, Ted, and Ian are kind of still like a core, sort of. And then he's also with the Ben, Evan, and Jane group. He's like just the center of the entire game at this point. He gets all those people in all those alliances to go for the remainder of the Red Tribe, led by Chris and Teo. They get rid of Chris. They get rid of Teo. Really easy. They even split the votes against Teo, so that's good. Then at Final 8, he has to start taking parts of this structure apart, and he does it really well. He gets rid of Evan first, who is the only person who's even suggested the fact that Max is controlling the game. And he's the centerpiece between Jane and Ben, so that's good. It leaves Jane and Ben alone. So I would say that round is really good. Now we get to the final 7, and the final 7 and final 6 rounds are the only 2 rounds in Max's game that I would say are slightly flawed. Now his position in these rounds and after these rounds isn't actually bad. It's just, I think his decision-making was slightly misguided. And that's really all it is, because if it weren't for that, he would be number 1 on this list easily. But because of that, he's all the way down at 3, and I even debated putting him 4. So at final 7, he, instead of deciding to go for Ben, he decides to go for Ted, which is questionable. Ben was alone. It wouldn't have caused any ruffled feathers to get rid of him. And he was the most likely person to start targeting Max because he had already started saying stuff like Max is controlling the game. He should have just voted out Ben here. But instead, he's like, no, there's all these duos. I gotta start taking them apart. So I'm gonna use Jane and Ian and Caleb, get rid of Ted. Sure, it's fine. The plan goes through smoothly. It's just the implications of this decision, I think, are not so great. Leaving Ben in is super dangerous, and also he was running the risk of Harry, being mad at him, even though he wasn't. He did really good damage control with Harry, so that's good for him, I guess. Ted also gets really bitter at him, which, it's Ted, so, what are you supposed to do? And, he couldn't have necessarily anticipated that. But then we get to the final 6, which is probably the round that's actually flawed, because the ramifications of the final 7 come back to bite him a little bit, where Ben gets to the final 6, and he's like, guys, come on. Max is very clearly controlling all of you. We gotta get rid of him. And Ben is actually able to get Ian and Caleb to think about voting out Max. And they do vote for Max, but Max has a good relationship with Jane and Harry and forces a tie. And then Ian and Caleb relent and then go back to Max when they realize they don't have a majority. But the fact that he was kind of close to going home here, these people were willing to vote him out and they just back out of it at the last second, is not good. He didn't have complete control here, and he could have avoided this by voting Ben out the round before. And if he had done that, then they just do Ted this round, and then he's good. So the order of voting out Ted and Ben is a minor flaw here. But he was safe regardless, because Jane and Harry were not going to vote him out for some reason. So you got to give him a lot of credit for setting up all these relationships. But this is a pretty major knock, honestly. It's definitely a bigger knock than anything in Chris D's game. And that's why I considered putting him at 4. But, it's just his game's so impressive. Chris's game is impressive too, but, it's not to this caliber, I would say. And then at final 5, he flips on Ian, gets rid of Ian. Ian somehow doesn't see it coming. Final four is kind of a mess because Jane gets medevaced, and then he obviously destroys Caleb and Harry in the jury vote. But I'll actually give him another minor knock because he actually did want to vote Caleb out, not Jane, at the final 4. And I've talked about this before, I think, but if Jane gets to the end with Max, I do think Max wins, but it's kind of a close vote, and he probably shouldn't have risked that. We can quickly run through the votes, but if it's Jane, Harry, and Max gets the locked votes of Ian and Ben, pretty clearly. Jane gets Teo, Chris, and Evan, and probably Ted, which is 4 votes out of 9. That's not good. I do think Max probably gets Mary and Declan, but, Declan's kind of up in the air. I do think he definitely leans Max. So that means the swing vote here is Caleb, which isn't good, but Ian is voting for Max, so I do think he probably gets Caleb, but that's not really a great position to be in. He almost lost the game because he was going to take Jane to the end. Now, she gets medevac, so he gets spared from that and does demolish the jury vote, but I don't know, it's kind of a big knock, and I actually can, now that I'm thinking about this, Max and Chris D are incredibly close on this list. Max has higher highs, but definitely lower lows. But he's still going to be a top-tier winner because of the sheer impressiveness of his power structure he creates. And he does make a lot of good moves, good social relationships. So, for now, he's still here at number 3. Alright, top 2 on the list. These top 2 are far and away numbers 1 and 2. And I do think there's a pretty clear number 1 and number 2, but I did debate about it because I do think they're both pretty not flawed, and it's kind of minor things that are separating them. But at number 2, I have the winner of Season 8, Aiden. And Aiden's game is pretty flawless, pretty impressive, and definitely deserving of being number 2 on this list. So going through it, it's a blood versus water season. Him and Dom do benefit from winning challenges together, but there's very few points in this game where Aiden actually would have gone home, if any. So the first round, he votes out Steven. Pretty good move, actually, because they could have just done Dan, but Steven definitely was a smarter, more long-term move. He picks up Harry and Grace as numbers, which is pretty good. Aiden's a good social player on this season. He picks up a lot of numbers. He doesn't go to tribal again before the swap, so jumping to the swap, he swapped onto a tribe that's not actually that good. I mean, it has Pierre, Dan, who are obviously together, and then Harry, who he kind of has, and then him and Lauren, who are obviously going to be together. And he probably should be voting out Pierre or Dan here, but he actually goes along with voting for Harry because Pierre and Dan want to vote for Harry for some reason, which is really stupid. And going along with Harry as the plan is fine because Dom's the one who's going to join the tribe, and then they have 3 out of 5, so it's kind of fell into his lap that Pierre was an idiot, but whatever. Regardless, he would have been fine because the other option was him, Lauren, and Harry voting out like Dan or Pierre, so he was fine here regardless, and actually just took advantage of Pierre being an idiot, so that's fine. At the next tribal, him, Dom, and Lauren vote out Pierre. Good move. They even split the votes to make sure Pierre doesn't shot in the dark his way to safety. At the merge, final 8, he, Dom, Chris, and Lauren are half of the tribe, so you could say he was benefited from the fact the cast was like a good amount of his friends, but it wasn't too many, it wasn't too overwhelming, and they all just played well, I would say. At the merge, he's kind of the center of the tribe. I mean, he's clearly the center of his own alliance with the 4 of them. The other 4 players kind of have better relationships with him than the others. Like, he has a really good relationship with Carson. Evan has a good relationship with Dom, which makes him balanced out on that side. He has Dan kind of, sort of. Dan's not really with anyone, but you can't really control Dan. And then Grace is the one blind spot. He thinks she's kind of with Chris, but they don't really get along at this point. So they vote out Grace. Good, I guess. The only round I'm going to knock him for is, yet again, the final 7 round. He and Dom actually probably wanted to get Chris out, but Chris has an idol, and they didn't know about that. So do I really fault him for trying to get rid of Chris and then not knowing about an idol? No, that's stupid. But I do think they split the votes kind of wrong. Their backup target was Carson, and Evan ends up going home because of the split vote. But, like, the plan was only messed up because of an idol. So, like, yes, it's sort of a miscalculation that Evan goes home over Carson, but A, it doesn't really matter because Carson and Evan are kind of interchangeable within their alliance. And actually, Carson probably has a better relationship with Aiden specifically, so it's actually better to be keeping Carson, but still going to knock him because this was a slight mess, but mostly because of an idol, so not really going to knock him that much. Final 6, he executes a split against Lauren and Chris, gets Lauren out, which was his optimal plan because he has a better relationship with Chris, and Dom has a better relationship with Lauren, so gotta credit him there. Final 5, he gets Dan out. Pretty good. It would have been Chris, but Chris had immunity, so whatever. And Dan was actually kind of a jury threat, so, like, it's probably a good move to be getting him out here. He enters the final 4 in such a good position. He has his partner, so there's a 50% chance of them winning immunity. Chris's number 1 ally is him. Carson's number 1 ally is him. Basically, Aiden has positioned himself perfectly. And I'm just going to say it, I don't think Aiden loses to anyone on this season. I think if he's sitting at the end with literally any 2 people next to him, he wins the game. He definitely beats Chris and Lauren. They weren't, like, super well respected. He definitely beats Dom, obviously, and Carson. I mean, we see that. The one person that I know people say is questionable is Dan because, like, everyone loves Dan. But I actually think Aiden beats Dan. Like, say the final 3 was Dan, Aiden, and Dom. I mean, Aiden's definitely getting Chris and Lauren. He's probably getting Carson. And while Dan probably gets probably Evan, Giancarlo, and Pierre. I do think Grace probably would have broken the tie in favor of Aiden, so I think he wins in that scenario, even though that's kind of the closest one, but that was also never happening, so who cares? He wins final immunity anyway, puts Chris and Carson in fire, because that's the only option, really. Chris gets eliminated, sure, it doesn't really matter. He kind of decimates the jury vote. I mean, it's a 4-2 to 1 vote, but, like, none of the 4 votes for him were really in question. Like, Pierre debated it, but, like, he was always going to vote for Aiden. Come on. Overall, Aiden, like, completely dominated this game from beginning to end. Very few hiccups. Really just the final 7 round, and that's barely anything. He was really good socially, directed the game strategically, was positioned pretty perfectly, and wins in every scenario, I'm pretty sure. So the only reason he's not number 1 on this list is because I think that the number 1 player had more direct sole control of the game. Like, Aiden shared a lot of his moves with Dom, with Chris. It was kind of more of an in-the-background game, sort of. I mean, he was pretty out in front, but, like, it wasn't until later in the game that people started realizing, oh, this was the Aiden show the whole time. This other player that's at number 1, that is probably pretty obvious, completely controlled the entire game from beginning to end. Everyone knew that, and everyone still let it happen and then voted for them at the end. And they don't really have any hiccups at all, so yeah, that's why Aiden's at number 2. So moving on to number 1, pretty obvious, but at number 1 we have the winner of Season 4, Cyrus. And Cyrus is the greatest Haddonfield Survivor player of all time, I guess. Wish he would have showed up to Legends to prove that. But in the 2 seasons we did get a Cyrus, I mean, this one's crazy. Season 4, he dominates the game. Season 5 is also a good game, but we're not talking about that today. So starting off Cyrus's Season 4 game, so on one hand, you could say Cyrus is a player kind of similar to like Harry, maybe even Aiden, but someone who came into this game with like a lot of people he was friends with outside the game, and that definitely helped with his positioning in the game, but it was definitely not a lockdown thing, and I'm also not going to discredit him for controlling the game because of that. And the other players still outnumbered his friend group, and his friend group, even within that, like, still had some variance within it. Some people were with certain people more so. Now, did they pregame before the season? Probably. However, again, not going to discredit him for any of that. So let's get into his actual game. So he starts off on the Orange Tribe, which is a pretty shitty tribe for him to start off on. It's a 4-person tribe with Chris and Isaac, who are friends outside the game, and Jackson, who he also doesn't know at all. And all of his alliance members are on the other 2 tribes, and people should know that he's going to join up with them, so he should be in a pretty shitty position, but he actually does really well. So he wins the battle against Jackson to be like the 3rd in the Chris and Isaac trio, which I do think was the right move. Gets Jackson out. Chris and Isaac trust him, which is really dumb on their part, but whatever. He only goes to the 1 tribal before the swap. At the swap, he's joined by Will and Jason, who are obviously his friends, so he's going to go with them, but he also has Chris and Isaac, who he could go with, but he's going to go with his friends, and it's actually an interesting vote because he's obviously the swing vote, but Chris and Isaac don't know that, and they kind of should have known that, and he even makes Chris think he's with him enough that Chris doesn't play his idol, which is completely ridiculous. Chris totally should be playing his idol in this situation. I understand that he wasn't fully aware of the fact that Cyrus, Will, and Jason were so close, but still, I mean, Cyrus was really good at snowing Chris in this season. But the more impressive part of all of this is honestly the fact that after Chris gets voted out, Isaac basically is able to be picked up by Cyrus and just become an extra number for him, which, yes, Isaac's like not that good of a player, but the fact that Cyrus was the one that was able to do that, to take advantage of that, is pretty impressive, especially because he just blindsided his best friend. After that, we get to the merge phase of the game. He doesn't go to another tribal. And his friends do enter the merge with 5 out of 8 numbers. So, like, yes, on one hand, he has pretty much control over the game because of that. But he plays pretty optimally even within that. So within his group, he's got him, Will, and Jason, who were from that swap tribe. But then there's also Samir and Evan, who were on the green tribe the whole time. And the 5 of them are obviously close. Obviously, Samir is his twin brother. But Cyrus, Jason, and Will have Isaac as an extra number, and they strategically decide to vote out Dan and Elliot first because they're the extra green numbers, and they don't want Samir and Evan to have other options. So first round of the merge, final 8, they get Dan out. Pretty good move, sure, pretty easy. Final 7's where it gets really interesting, though, and really strategically dominant from Cyrus. So Elliot wins immunity. Their intended target is off the board. Samir and Evan obviously suggest Isaac because he's the other person not in their alliance. But Cyrus isn't going to get rid of his goat. Why would he do that? So, of course, naturally, he, Will, and Jason. And yes, you have to give credit to probably Will more so than Jason. But you got to give Will kind of shared credit for this. But that group plus Isaac does decide to flip on Samir this round. And they actually do a good job because Evan and Samir still think it's going to be Isaac, don't see it coming. And Cyrus blindsides his twin brother. Pretty good move. And also positioning-wise, he's in such a good position at this point because Elliot all alone, Evan all alone. He has Isaac as a backup number. Will and Jason are a bit of a blind spot, kind of, but not really. I mean, they're in his alliance. Yes, they might eventually flip on him, but he just has to make sure he picks up the remainder of the numbers, including Elliot and Evan. The next round, they decide to stay the course and vote out Evan, which I think makes sense because Cyrus was really working on Elliot and trying to get him as another number for him. And who knows if Evan would have been another number for Will once that eventual time came for Will and Cyrus to go at each other. So yeah, then we get to Final 5. Cyrus and Isaac, along with Elliot, decide to flip on Will, get Will out of the game, Cyrus's biggest threat. Even though, honestly, at this point, Cyrus is going to beat everyone at the jury vote. I know people like to claim that Elliot would have won. Not true at all. If you look at the jury votes, Elliot maybe gets 2 votes from Dan and Giancarlo. But Cyrus was getting all of the class of 22 votes, and definitely Chris also. So there was no way he was going to lose to anyone, in my opinion. So yeah, Will's out. Final 4. Somehow Jason and Isaac are not targeting Cyrus still. Elliot does realize, we should probably get rid of Cyrus, but he's not able to convince anyone. Jason was kind of on the fence about it, but after Jason won immunity, he was like, no, I don't need to do that. That's unnecessary. And Cyrus's control over these players is ridiculous. And yes, some of them are not the strongest players ever. It's kind of like a Boston Rob Redemption Island situation where he's running circles around these players, but there's an argument that they're not that good in the first place. But I don't know. First of all, I don't think that's really necessarily true. I don't think Jason and Elliot are that bad of players. And second of all, that doesn't make it any less impressive. But yeah, he gets Elliot out at the Final 4, who was probably the biggest jury threat. I mean, he still beats Elliot, but he was definitely a bigger jury threat than Jason or Isaac. And then we get to the final jury vote, where he demolishes them in the jury vote. He wins 6-1-0. He only loses Elliot's vote, and Elliot has this dumb rationale about how, Jason got him out, so he needs to vote for Jason, and he knows Cyrus is going to win, so it doesn't matter. But it's still dumb. I mean, first of all, Cyrus was the one directing that vote that got Elliot out. It wasn't actually Jason. So I don't see the point of this move. But it doesn't matter. Obviously, Cyrus is going to win. None of the jurors were even wavering between voting for him or one of the other ones. I will say, though, that the only knock I can possibly think of against Cyrus's game is Final Tribal. If you go watch it back, he's so cocky about his game, which obviously he should be because he just dominated the entire game. But some of the jurors are like, oh my god, this guy, he thinks so highly of himself about his game. But even despite that, I mean, the speech obviously still goes over all of his game points. And it doesn't really do anything to change any of the minds of the jurors. They just, are slightly irritated. So, pretty minor knock. Definitely a smaller knock than anything that I took from any of the other people in the top tiers games. Incredibly impressive win. Easily the most dominant. Easily number 1. Maybe not the most impressive because of the pregame situations. I would say that Max and probably Chris W. are, more savvy, but Cyrus was just outright so dominant that you have to put him at number 1. And there you have it. That's all 9 Haddonfield Survivor winners ranked based on their winning games. I hope you all do not disagree too much. I know there's only 4 of you who probably really care about this in-depth strategic analysis. But yeah, just my opinion. Thanks for watching the video. don't know if I'll have any other videos to make for Haddonfield Survivor, but I enjoyed making this one. Thanks for watching.